Welcome back to RAINCOAT. Today we are switching gears from healthcare and COVID-19 to global security and climate change. How exactly can people work together for collective impact when it comes to global security? We have two guests, Carol Dumaine and Rod Schoonover.
Hello and welcome to RAINCOAT.
My name is Isabelle.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are excited to share how academia, industry, and communities can work together on complex problems and improve knowledge translation.
Awesome. So we have Carol Dumaine, who has over 30 years of experience as a U.S. intelligence community analyst with an emphasis on strategic and emerging global security issues, including climate change. And she is a recognized innovator and foresight practitioner with areas of expertise including global and national security affairs, climate change, intelligence analysis, and multiple scenario analysis. She has also led the Global Futures Partnership, which engaged with external non-government expertise to improve foresight on unclassified transnational security issues. On the flip side, we have Rod Schoonover, who is the head of the Ecological Security Program at the Council on Strategic Risks. He is also the founder and CEO of the Ecological Futures Group, which really examines natural security and societal dimensions of global ecological change. He has previously served as the Director of Environment and Natural Resources, as well as the Director of Global Health at the National Intelligence Council, and as a Senior Scientist and Senior Analyst in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. What a long intro. Both of you are just so accomplished.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's our pleasure.
Thanks for having us. And it's a pleasure to be on with my friend Carol.
Thank you. Likewise, Rod.
So to get started with you two, we would like to talk a little bit more about that topic, security. What does security actually mean?
Good question. Rod, did you want to jump in first? Or?
Well, let me do the easy one, right? Because in its most basic form, security is protection from harm or resilience against harm. And that harm can be from people. That harm can be from non-state actors. Or that harm can come from our surroundings.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And we're living through, one of the most disruptive event of the last 100 years.
Exactly. And as you mentioned in our introductions, we both have a background in national security in the U.S. national security establishment. So it bears mentioning here that the concept of security as a national security issue evolved in the United States since World War II, and specifically the paradigm we have today, I should say, evolved, in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, the surprise attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so the resulting sort of defense of the realm concept, meaning defending the nation against the attacks, potential attacks of foreign state aggressors, was sort of the operative principle for national security for decades that followed. So the idea there was to avoid the recurrence of such a surprise attack and to defend the nation's territorial sovereignty. Even after the end of the Cold War, this paradigm sort of overhung the understanding of national security, and it's also influenced Western democracies' ideas of security. So when you kind of pair that with what Rod just said, I think you can start to tease out, some of the tensions and differences in, how the concept of security is actually applied at a nation state level. Since, based on what Rod just said, security itself is a much more diffuse and larger concept with many meanings depending on which fields you consult.
Well, I think it's we could sit here and talk about national security for a long period of time. But I think it's an important thing to talk about. And it's not just U.S. national security, of course. Every large nation has a national security doctrine and architecture. Both Carol and I have publicly spoken about the need for security agencies to rethink how it approaches and how it addresses national security in order to really match the security threats that are being presented currently and in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I would, and I know Rod agrees, that we're at a point, past a point really, where we needed to really rethink of what we mean, not only by national security, but global security and any of the types of security, human security, in the context of an Earth system that's been radically altered by human activities. But before we leave the idea of the definition, I wanted to mention that one definition that resonates with me is freedom from fear. And fear itself is a tremendous vulnerability from the point of view of national security. And stoking fear is a known weapon of choice among authoritarians to keep the public submissive and compliant. So if freedom from fear would be taken seriously, I would submit that it has implications for a whole range of policies, like economic policies and public health policies, including in the United States. So this really intersects, in my opinion, with this different sort of climate change altered Earth system reality that we're living in right now.
So one topic that has occupied us for the last 2 years is, for example, COVID-19, and climate change is an ongoing topic. I was wondering, when does a public health issue become a security issue?
So a health issue that has rapid onset or causes quite a bit of disruption, societal disruption or political disruption, would also presumably be thought of in a security context. I think there's a great many public health concerns that cross over into the security world. I would consider antimicrobial resistance to be one such issue because of the number of different ways it changes any number of different operating situations, including military action.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. And in fact, I sort of expected, perhaps unrealistically, to see a greater sea change in thinking about security earlier on in the COVID-19 pandemic itself, because the effects of the pandemic sort of laid a socio-topographical map over, let's say, the United States, but the world at large, and showed us where the vulnerabilities are in the way our modern economy is actually working, because the hardest hit communities were the already marginalized communities. And I think that points to pockets of insecurity that aggregate into larger national level insecurity. But in addition to that sort of public health concern, a pandemic, let's say, there's the issue of mental health as a public health concern. And there have been studies done recently and polls, surveys of young people that's between, I think, 16 and 25 years old in at least 10 different countries that showed a great majority of them, I don't remember the percentage exactly, suffering from feelings of sadness, despair, and anger at the lack of effective climate change mitigation action in the world, and concerns about, their future. And this is not, the issue of mental health is not part of the national security paradigm or international security paradigm, but I think it ought to be. And this is indicative of how we need this sea change or paradigmatic change in what we consider to be a security issue, because the concerns of younger generations is pointing to issues of intergenerational fairness or equity that are very real security issues for them. And yet it's not integrated into our public policies. And we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg on this.
Is there a specific way you handle things differently when there is a security issue, but that's also a public health issue?
Well, the answer is, unfortunately, yes. It should not be true that we would deal with public health differently when it's deemed a security issue, but because national security and international security have different resources, have different authorities, have different engagement with the public. When you view or articulate public health as a security issue, that invokes a whole set of other principles and actors into the discussion. And I actually think that's appropriate. As I said earlier, we're living through the biggest disruption that the Earth, at least the human part of the Earth, has experienced in 100 years. The economic, social, political, and informational stress that has come about from the microbiosphere should be humbling to us. And remember, security is the protection from harm, right? That includes the harm to our health. And so if we don't see the protection of our citizens as a security issue writ large, I'm not sure what could better be defined as a security issue.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that too, I think we need a lot more introspection about who defines what a security issue is for a nation. How has that come about over time, and does that itself need to change? And whose security deserves defending? What security are we trying to protect? And who's been left out of this consideration for security, and why? So in America, the authority for defining national security has traditionally been a function reserved to those holding political power. And in my experience, it hasn't really been a topic of widespread and frequent citizen participation. And if you'll recall the aftermath right after 9/11, decisions taken then did not receive a lot of public debate. And nonetheless, they did a lot to transform the national security narrative in the United States that have proven very damaging to the democratic principles and values undergirding the American experiment. And it's also had global ramifications all around the world. So, in fact, I think you can draw a straight line from that experience to the fact that security itself is a more polarized and partisan topic in the U.S. And I think, therefore, that it's not clear that we can have national security if citizens don't share a common understanding of what is factual and what is fiction. So the whole thing about disinformation comes into play here. And how does that affect our thinking about security in an age of these massive Earth system disruptions that Rod just referred to?
And if I can also talk about national security and its evolution, because it does change, and it has changed over the years. Traditionally, national security was really about nation-state security, and still to this day, a lot of people, especially outside of the capitals, would think about national security is that's the thing that the military does. That's the thing that the Pentagon does. But even in the 20th century, we saw greater attention to non-state actors, economic security, and then, of course, human security. The security of the individual became a rather important piece of not just U.S. national security, but other nations and international security. And so that's a logical entry point for health security, and food security, and water security. And I think, people like Carol and myself think, there's still something missing from this discussion. And it has to do with how do we conceive of threats that arise that are actorless in nature, right? So-called actorless security threats. And so, for example, COVID-19 is causing tremendous disruption, but it's not something that the standard national security apparatus and even doctrine can even address. There's nothing to point a drone at. There's nothing to point, a military at, or a microphone. But they still cause harm. And so we just can't even really easily, and when I say we, I'm talking about our national architectures, our national security architectures, really can't grasp this because it's outdated. It was created for a different time. And as Carol mentioned, our Earth systems are such, we passed a discontinuity probably 10, 15 years ago. We live in a different world. Even if we don't recognize it, we live in a different world because of climate change, because of increases in infectious diseases, because of massive biodiversity loss, a whole number of issues. The world that the national security community was trained for and built for, that world is, if essentially doesn't exist in the way that they think it does. Mm-hmm. And so we think, I'll speak for myself, I think that that national security and international security, if it's really going to protect people, the people of their nations and the globe, has to scope the threat correctly. And if you don't scope the problem, you never get the right solution.
So, okay, I really want to dive into this actorless security issues, which includes climate change. So we talked a little bit about what security kind of means and that it's broader than just kind of a military security piece. So going to the IPCC 6th assessment, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, based on this really long report, the summary is basically, we're running out of time. We need to do drastic action. We can cut down on these emissions, but we need to do it kind of now. But are there any other highlights that you got out of this report, Rod, that really stuck out to you?
I think that so there are 3 reports, right? There's the Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. I think Working Group 2, the report that really talks about what are the implications and the stresses. They don't use the word stress, but I think of it that way. What are the implications for people and the rest of the planet of climate change? So Report 1 establishes what we know. Report 2 establishes so what. And the thing is, if you really look critically at that second report, it enumerates a a great many ways that climate change will affect people. And so, when you bring up, that we're running out of time, and even inside of the IPCC, they talk about the consequences if transformative change is not undertaken. And in fact, the other giant report that's relevant to this discussion from 2019 by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services used the same kind of language, that if nations and the globe do not undertake transformative change, then humanity will be in considerable harm. And so someone like me, a security person and a scientist, I look at that and go, well, I don't see transformative change happening. And so what does that mean? And it certainly has security dimensions, right? And so, and if you just start ticking off all of the different pieces of the way, the different ways that humans may be harmed, through water stress, through food insecurity, through erosion of economic livelihoods, loss of residence and property, risks to human health, negative impacts on education, intensified violence. These are all different types of security that are not military in nature, right? And so there was a 2018 Nature climate change article. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Broad implications for humanity from climate change. And in this report, and it had 40 authors, it enumerates 450 or so pathways by which humanity will be affected by climate change. And so, again, if you want to scope the threat of climate change properly, you kind of have to look at it from that kind of gargantuan lens. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that is enumerated in report 2. And I think that's, it's a tough report to read. It's ominous, but it's vitally important to really understand what we're talking about beyond rising sea levels and some heat waves.
So on that piece, it sounds like there's always a lot of news about the impacts of climate change, such as the ones detailed in the report, but also in the news, and kind of the attention-grabbing titles are about, if we don't keep our temperatures within a certain amount of degrees, we're all going to die. So it's all about kind of the impacts, but there's not a whole lot of news about what really been done. Why aren't the things that actually should be happening for climate change being reported as much as the impacts? Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll be quick about it, and then let Carol go on with a longer answer. With respect to climate change, I think we have to really understand it. It is more than just a set of policy failures. It is also a communication failure. The general public does not really understand climate change. There's a lot of disinformation with a lot of resources behind that disinformation that has helped muddy the water. And, we're getting to the point where the newspapers and the media is covering climate change better and more in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. But it's 20 years too late, or 20 years later than it should have been. Mm-hmm. Right? This should have been happening in our rearview mirror.
Mm-hmm. I would just say that there are important things going on all around the world, and I kind of yearn for an aggregator that regularly puts this in front of our faces and sort of accelerates the advances and the innovation. Right. But bigger than that, I would suggest is this need for a whole new context. So Rod talked about how the Earth itself has gone through this massive rupture. He might not have used that word, but a massive discontinuity. societally novel, unknown in the history of human civilization. So we're literally, to abbreviate it, we're already living on a different planet with which we have no familiarity. So we need to put all this in a new context. And then I would say test fly through the context, the wind tunnel of this new context, our inherited concepts of security, of economy, of wealth, of success, of education, of everything, basically, because everything has to be rethought. And if that were understood, then we would see more stories and more connection. If people really grasped how existential this is, it wouldn't just be an add-on in the media coverage. I think the rupture in Earth systems needs to be matched by acknowledging the rupture in our ways of knowing, how we know things about humankind's place in the world. And this needs to be translated in our design of education across all levels.
Rod, you just mentioned earlier that people do not fully understand what is going on. And one part is, I think, it has to do with long-term thinking. So how do you get people to care about and imagine things that feel so abstract?
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, I think one of the things that is helpful, so I teach climate change at the university here in DC. I think one of the things that is important is to try to explain why it is not simply an environmental problem. And so that's where I start typically and talk about climate change. If you think about the very original stress on the planet, it is a temperature change. And so temperature, like sunlight, like gravity, is one of the control variables of the planet. And so by adjusting that control variable, you're doing more than just changing the weather and the climate, in fact. Anything that is temperature dependent, whether it is a physical process or a chemical process or a biological process, ecological, agricultural, industrial, sociological process, if they are temperature dependent, they may be changed and are likely to be changed by climate change. And so I think getting it out of the world of the of envirospeak is crucial because, for example, I'm from the great state of Kansas in the United States. It would be forgiven for people in Kansas, over the last 20 years to think that climate change would not affect them because so often climate change is mentioned in terms of sea level rise or the Arctic melting, when in fact, agriculture and crop production, which I do not consider environmental issues, are quite affected by temperature and precipitation. And so the thing is that we have to thread this narrative into people's lives, right? It affects health, it affects agriculture, it affects labor, it affects inequity. Everyone is affected by climate change, not to the same degree, of course, but just talking about it in ways that are meaningful to people, I think, is how you engage them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think also the relationship between disease and pandemics and climate change and environmental breakdown is sort of lost on people. But since we're all experiencing this COVID-19 pandemic together, there has been an opportunity to help people understand that disease outbreaks that can become pandemics stem from ecological breakdown, ecological degradation. And so the ways in which we've been pursuing economic activities all these years is not sustainable. And of course, a lot of people know that. But where's the big thinking going on about new economic approaches? It is going on, but I almost never see it discussed in sort of mainstream newspapers. So I go elsewhere for my reporting. I think the Boston Review is very good on this, but I would expect to see more thinking about how can we coexist harmoniously with non-human species, because it's their security too that we should be thinking about. And I can assure you that's not part of the dominant security thinking paradigm.
And if I might jump on something that Carol is communicating, because it's really important. If we just could imagine as a scenario, let's imagine that the biosphere is in real trouble. Forget whether it is or it isn't. But let's just say it is. How would it manifest itself? How would we know? And it would almost certainly be through pests and disease, right? At least a strong factor. And one of the things that we know from climate change, that again, one of these outcomes that a lot of people don't know about, but is highly consequential, is that the inhabitants of the biosphere are going through a massive reorganization. Species are moving towards the poles. We can measure it. We can actually track climate change by that. And they're moving upward in altitude. But they're not all going at the same rate. And there's new forms of what some of us call differential biotic mixing. So new ways of species mixing on the planet, in terrestrial settings and marine settings. And when you have new mixing, it follows that you have new opportunities for zoonotic disease. And these pathogens that inhabit these species that are moving are oftentimes evolutionarily predisposed to hop. And so we are creating a planet where the so-called fast-lived organisms, right, that inhabit the microbiosphere and small animals are going to thrive, and more complex, slow-lived animals and primates like us are at a disadvantage.
And in this context, I was thinking of one of your newsletters, Carol. You spoke about, I think in March, about the perils of indifference based on Elie Wiesel, who says by denying the humanity of those who are suffering, we betray our own. And you add on that in a world in which over 3 billion people use smartphones, nearly all of us now bear witness to inhumanity wherever it occurs and is documented publicly. So you give examples about COVID-19 and the Ukraine-Russian war. When thinking of global security and climate change, do you think social media has actually the power to do the opposite and actually help us become more human by showing us what we destroy?
Well, I actually think it already is having that effect. It might be hard to parse it out from use of social media that gets more attention for negative reasons. But I think social media, particularly on Twitter, it really had a lot of potential because it connects experts very rapidly. And I've learned all kinds of arcane knowledge I didn't know I needed about tired treads and so forth, and mud, and so the conditions in Ukraine and how that affects Russia. I mean, all kinds of people who are passionate about different topics have come together in a very transdisciplinary pooling of knowledge because they all understand one simple objective, which is to speed up sort of our knowledge, which has been pigeonholed away in different departments, or a lot of retired people have knowledge which, younger people still in service can't freely, contribute to a social media platform. And of course, there's a potential there for wrong information or disinformation. But yes, I do think social media has a big role to play, and perhaps even essential role, because when you think about the speed with which these organisms that Rod was talking about sort of hopping and mutating and so forth, it's not an original idea to me, but we're in a race against these sorts of mutations. And this has been pointed out years ago. There was a book called The Global Brain, I think Harold Bloom, who talked about, how microbes would be viruses, microbes would be more rapidly adapting. And it's hard for, the world of human intellect to think that we're being outgunned by these invisible, viruses. But it makes it imperative to have different ways and more effective ways to harness knowledge around the world. So social media is a platform or a way of doing that. And we've kind of had it go on autopilot and then be leveraged by some darker interests. But I think if it becomes more profitable or seen as necessary to save our planet, that we could also harness social media to work towards that goal too.
Would we have really heard about Greta Thunberg had it not been for social media? I think the climate youth activism has been critical in moving nations towards more ambition in climate. I personally know the climate change negotiators for the United States, and I know that they have been affected by those movements.
Mm-hmm. And similarly for democracy, I think maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see, but I think the stories of what's happening in Ukraine, and also the reminders that similar atrocities have happened in other regions of the world that didn't get the same degree of attention, and that mixed with authoritarianism, the threat that authoritarianism poses to democracy, is sort of activating a higher level consciousness about the risks to democracy and how we have to work across boundaries to protect it and maybe bring it to a better level of, a different level of democratic coexistence.
Yeah, social media is a big way of behavior change, and thinking about behavior change, if we think about climate change, most changes are addressed from an economic perspective. So have economic behavior change strategies like increased tax on gas or paying for plastic bags. Have those been proven more effective for climate change rather than individual behavior change strategies?
I don't know of any study that tries to gauge the effectiveness of different strategies. We, especially in the United States, we live in such a capitalistic country that is the bag of solutions that we just tend to go towards. In terms of individual action and individual impact on climate change, you have to integrate this over a lifetime, right? Not just what it's doing day to day. And so, there's a terrific project / book called Project Drawdown. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it is a institute really that looks at the most effective ways to bring down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And they're not the solutions that you would normally think about that would come first. It talks about reducing food waste, improving girls' education worldwide. It's only when you get down, 5 or 6, do you get to things like turbines and solar farms. Another big one is eating a plant-rich diet. It's not arguing to be vegetarian. It's arguing for more plants because when you look at the problem of climate change, it's not just electricity and it's not just cars. There's a big component of agriculture and forest policy. And so individual action has a lot of impact, at least theoretically, right? I don't know if the world of supply and demand, if that world actually exists anymore inside of economic textbooks. Mm-hmm. But that said, the integrated impact of many people doing this for long stretches of time is quite significant.
I would just like to add to that topic that we have to also get to some root causes that aren't exactly attributable to individual actions. And they're very entangled causes and effects, entangled with the actual history of capitalism itself. And this manifests itself today in terms of wealth and carbon emissions inequality. And we don't hear very much about that, actually. And we can't really effectively control or curb climate change and biodiversity breakdown if we don't address these sources of inequality. And this isn't really a typical focus for security analysis because, at least in the West, our whole Western idea of security is premised upon the fossil fuel-based energy system. And it's not really premised upon making transparent these sources of inequality because capitalism itself has been based on, famously on, colonialism and extraction and enslavement even. So we have to actually bring all that out into the open. And of course, there's a huge backlash against that, particularly in the United States, under the rubric of this critical race theory, which applies to a very, as I understand it, just one course at a law school level and is not taught anywhere in kindergarten through 12th grade. But there's a great controversy over this. And it's just a moniker to say we don't want that transparency that I'm talking about. Like, how did we get to this precipice where we're facing the need to change, as Rod said, all of our systems in a few years? That's what the scientists are telling us. So we need the younger generations to be able to unpack this history. And our teachers are doing a good job, I think, on that, but everyone recognizes the need to do more. So we're caught in this political polarization storm right now.
And if I can just add very briefly, back to the premise of your question, we cannot address climate change through individual action alone. It doesn't work. It's not enough. Governments and international institutions need to be a part of it, and otherwise we fall far short of where we need to be. So I think there's a real delicate dance here on climate change because you don't want to remove agency from people, right, and make them feel that their actions don't matter. But we also have to, at the same time, recognize without governments and without industry, we don't get there. We don't get to a safe future.
I think this aspect has just been really highlighting all the different players that make towards hopefully addressing climate change in the future, and that it's not just kind of a straightforward black and white issue that we're dealing with. But I want to tie this back into the definition of what we typically focus on, which is now knowledge translation. And according to the CIHR, it's defined as a process that includes the contextualization, integration, and communication, as well as the interaction between kind of the end user as well as the researcher or the person kind of developing the knowledge. So I know we talked a little bit about kind of examples such as speaking in ways and trying to persuade folks in ways that are meaningful to them, or really understanding the relations and highlighting kind of the importance of relationships and all of that. So in your opinions, how do you think global security utilizes some of these concepts that fall under knowledge translation? A bit of a hefty question.
It is. I'm just trying to decide where I'd like to maybe start with that, and pardon me if it's kind of an indirect approach to your question. So I've been enthralled with the story of Alexander von Humboldt, who was this Prussian explorer in the very early, beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s, who, to put it in a very short way, took a trip as a young man for 5 years, it turned out, to South America, and mapped out the Andes and perceived basically that colonial era agricultural practices were affecting the climate even then, and that if you aggregated this to a global level, over time, man's activities, he was thinking, this was pre-industrial, he was thinking mostly from an agricultural point of view, would create a climate crisis, basically. And why I mention this now is because he was thinking in a whole systems way. And it was very, very ecologically sensitive and very future-oriented. And I think it was a good example, even for now, of, if you want to talk about transnational collaboration as a solution, looking at these things through a global frame is absolutely essential, and also becoming more self-aware and even self-critical, I would say, about how we have practiced sort of an imperialism with just knowledge itself, that have left out other knowledge traditions, such as the indigenous knowledge traditions of all regions of the world, and what the impact has been of colonialism, which has similarly sort of marginalized different ways of knowing. And I've been influenced by, in thinking about this, by a professor whose work I just came across, whose name I'm not going to forget, not going to remember properly, but I think it's de Souza from Portugal, Santos de Souza, I hope I got that right, who has a book called The Cognitive Empire. So basically, we need to unpack all the things that were packed up so tightly and called disciplines since the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment of the mid 18th century. That was a time of great advances in knowledge and great organization of knowledge that actually led to all the disciplines and the practice of specialization that we have today. But von Humboldt was kind of running against the current then by putting it all back together, systems thinking in the early 1800s.
And I'm a big fan of von Humboldt's, and so my degree is in complex systems physics, which is really systems thinking, with lots of math. And so, when you talk about, knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation, really that was what I did as an intelligence officer. My job as a scientist inside of the intelligence community was to take science, whether it was the science of climate change or fisheries science or infectious disease science, and translate it and mobilize it and put it into the hands of the people who needed it. In my case, and Carol's case, it was the national security community. It was, in fact, very often the White House, and sometimes the head of state, the President of the United States. And so the issue of mobilizing knowledge and making it actionable, that's what the intelligence community does, right? Among other agencies inside of the government. And so this has kind of been this has been my entire life. When I was a PhD student, and when I was a professor, when I was an intelligence analyst, and what I'm doing now is trying to take those scientific findings and make them understandable and relevant for people who need to act on it. Now, here's the problem. There are precious few of those people in the government who understand things like zoonotic spillover or antimicrobial resistance or climate change. Who there are some, but if we think about the major risks to humanity, in the next decade or so, they're among those I just listed. And so it seems like at least the security communities of the nations that I'm familiar with are falling short internally of being able to translate science and scientific findings to those policymakers. And one thing that I noticed, I got extremely busy inside of the intelligence community because a lot of the questions coming down from the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, or the President, or whatever, were increasingly scientific in nature, right? They were asking questions about this topic and that topic. It is the job of the security community to answer those to the best of their ability. If that community is not literate in climate or zoonotic spillover or whatever, then they're going to come up short in answering those questions. And if I may, very recently, the U.S. intelligence community was asked to assess the origins of COVID-19, right? And so hopefully the security community has a lot of people trained that can understand zoonotic spillover at the molecular level. Otherwise, you may entertain other theories that are much less plausible, like maybe leaking from a lab.
Mm-hmm. When you were in that work, and especially translating knowledge to the White House, how did you not let politics interfere with the change you are trying to bring about?
It actually wasn't very hard, Isabelle, because I was in a community where I really didn't know the political stance of pretty much anyone around me, mm-hmm. Unless they were very vocal. And so, I still stick to my guns that that science and evidence and reality are not partisan in nature, right? People can opt to make those partisan, but they are in essence, a partisan topic. And so for me, I would talk to both Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill. And, sometimes they didn't like what I heard or what I said, but I still said it. And so, it's actually not that difficult until you're put in a position where, what you're saying is being compromised or censored or suppressed.
I think, Carol, earlier you mentioned the concept of enlightenment back in the 18th century. And in one of your papers, you talked about how we need kind of a new enlightenment that's better matched to the 21st century challenges. And based on your expertise, what would that kind of look like?
Yeah, okay. I'm still working this out myself, but, in the European Enlightenment, it was partly due to a wider awareness of other cultures in the world, due to the reports explorers were bringing back, and a wider awareness that there were people living all around the world who were never mentioned in the Bible, which was sort of the center of all knowledge in Europe for a long, long time. That started to kind of open up optics on different ways of knowing, and actually created an environment for thinkers, we can call them enlighteners, to wrestle with ideas that later became known as human rights, democracy, the rule of law. It was all very imperfect and very nascent, and there wasn't just one enlightenment. There are a lot of different enlightenments from what I've read, and they tend to be considered today with a broad brush, sometimes in a very critical way, that a lot of white men who were, in favor of colonialism and slavery, but in fact, the names that we can most readily mention today were very much vehemently against those, against the colonialism as well as slavery. But in a way, that tradition in the West brought us to where we are today, thinking in a very separated way between the world of human affairs and the world of nature, which, contrary to Humboldt's view, the dominant paradigm matched with the needs of industrialization was that nature exists to be extracted, to be exploited. It's an inert resource there for the taking, and actually provided by God to man to be exploited. And unfortunately, tragically, that those resources included actually other human beings. But where we are today, if you take it in terms of the rupture that we were talking about, which is also addressed in a book by an Australian, Clive Hamilton, called The Defiant Earth, where, he really talks about how we've left the Holocene period of relatively conducive climate, a conducive to human civilization sort of climate, and entered a new geological epoch that is permanently changed and permanently disrupted. We clearly need a new way of kind of understanding humankind's role in this disrupted world, this world that actually we had a hand in creating through our economic activities. So, and the new enlightening would actually go well beyond the Western Enlightenment that we've inherited, and it would actually emphasize earth system science and climate change literacy in every sector, which I don't think is yet the case at all levels of education. And it would instill that sort of systems thinking, perhaps with all the sophistication of broad scientific education. But perhaps for some people, it doesn't need to reach that level. But a futures orientation, a responsibility for the future, and integrate into everything we do a consideration of intergenerational equity. I think that would be very revolutionary. Let's say make the world safe for all children alive. That too would be revolutionary. Children are typically kind of forgotten. They're not voting. They're not of voting age. And if they were, what would we be emphasizing today? And this new enlightening would be also very considerate, integrate non-human species, because we're all ecologically part of the same system. So it would have to be transdisciplinary, and that has huge implications for what we call security today. So security might have to draw from the fields of neuroscience and psychological and mental health, as well as earth system science. And we also might want to, there are different, there's a whole host of implications, but we need to understand what are the barriers to this understanding? How is disinformation playing a role? Who are the power brokers behind that disinformation? Former U.S. President Obama just gave a very public talk about the dangers of disinformation. And we need to integrate different knowledge traditions from non-Western and non-Eurocentric sources, as well as indigenous sources. That would all be quite a different approach to knowledge, I would submit.
And I was in awe of listening to the kind of world that you just painted. If I would inject one little thing into that, it would be, in addition to disinformation, really some deep thinking about misinformation as well, which is less deliberate, but probably just as harmful. I live in Capitol Hill, just a few blocks away from the Capitol, and what happened in our country in January 6th was probably the result of a lot of people believing something that was not real, and the effects, the corrosive effects of poor information, disinformation, and active disinformation. I think we undervalue that. And if you go back to the Enlightenment, the search for truth, how do we know? How do we know what's real? How do we know, how the universe works? That was a fundamental core of the Enlightenment, the capital E Enlightenment. And so I'd like to see a return to truth and evidence over marketing and counter marketing as societal strategies.
That sounds great to me.
There's still a lot to explore in that area. So speaking about that knowledge translation piece, which I think is a big part of the modern Enlightenment, how do we need to address global security from your perspective to account for current problems? And first of all, what is currently being done, but more, what role does KT and transnational collaboration play?
I think that your questions, Isabelle, come at a really critical juncture right now in sort of the evolution of security thinking, or at least the potential for new security thinking, because with what's going on in Ukraine, it's clear that we can't turn away from old and resurgent security realities that are reminiscent of the darkest times of the 20th century. They're still going on, and yet they have global implications, ripple effects as well. So it's a very challenging set of security challenges. But all this is taking place in the context still of the climate change, biodiversity crisis, which isn't you can't put it on pause. It's not just waiting for us to come back after this Ukraine-Russia crisis is solved. No, they're part and parcel, very, very much related. One of the nexuses is, energy security related, obviously. So the challenge is we can't bin these things into different departments. And I'd just like to suggest that we might need a new security realism. Up to now, there's been ideas about hard security issues and soft security issues, and climate change was never really a hard security issue, and realpolitik would have to trump, issues of environmental degradation or human rights abuses, whatever. But the new security realism may have to supplant this realpolitik of the old, and integrate them together in a new framing that gives absolutely due attention to the ecological breakdown. So I search the usual sources for this integrated analysis, and I haven't found it very much, I have to say. And I think that's a shortcoming right now.
And from my view, and I agree with all of what Carol just said, I would add that recognition of climate change as a security issue is growing. It was a nascent idea 10, 12 years ago, and there are a number of academics and people in the think tank world, NGOs, and in government, including the United States government currently, who do see climate change as a security issue. And just make sure I run off. We're really talking about beyond human security. We're talking about inputs to political instability and social discohesion and heightened tensions over water and land or fish, in addition to adverse effects on the militaries themselves. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of climate as a security risk. And so recognition of that it is required, but it's not enough, right? You actually need to have a climate literate workforce in the national security world. Again, not just the United States. Most countries need to infuse climate thinking into their national security thinking, into the security thinking writ large. I would also include homeland security in that discussion as well. And so, we're quite we're much improved from where we used to be. But it's nowhere near enough. And the things that Carol mentioned in terms of ecological breakdown, which will have almost certain security concerns, right? Breakdown in pollination will have effects on food security. Breakdowns in soil will have impacts on food security and just land stability. But those kinds of thinking, that kind of way of thinking, really needs to be really injected into security doctrine. And so there's still quite a ways to go. But we're not where we should be, but we're further along than we used to be because of voices like Carol here.
And Rod, yep.
So we talked a lot about how it'd be great to get more voices into play, really integrate different perspectives so that we can move forward into becoming a more equitable paradigm, I suppose. So how do you think we can go about making this collaboration happen? And how do we make sure that the intended impact occurs?
It's a big question. I would encourage journals with already extensive readership to embrace the topic of, just for shortness sake, new economic thinking in a climate disrupted world. Who are the thinkers? Who are today's enlighteners? They don't have to have all the answers, but connect up those thinkers across the disciplines. And no one journal is going to be able to do it all. So we need to connect up the journals, and social media needs to be aware of that, just to have more of a intellectual movement, because I don't think one think tank's going to do it. And I don't see this joined up thinking happening very widely, is what I've already said. So, but I don't think there's time to create a lot of new vehicles, a lot of new institutions, but we have to nudge existing ones in this direction. That would be one way anyway, I'd suggest.
I agree with that. As I said before, I think our Earth system breakdown is only partially a government and policy failure. It's also a communication failure. And so re-injecting media with both evidence-based information and also relevance to people. But the question you ask is a good one, because organizations and institutions naturally silo. This is you create an institution, and when it gets big enough, it just spontaneously starts to fragment. And so you have to work to keep it cohesive. So you can't expect to create something and expect it to remain that way. This is just one of the basic, it's not mathematical, but it's a law of nature that things tend to fragment. And so it takes work to keep it, to defragment an institution or a movement or, a way of thinking. And so, of course, that's harder to do than just what I just said. But if you don't recognize the need, you'll never do it.
Mm-hmm. And also, I would say bring in voices that aren't being heard enough. The younger generations, the climate activists, indigenous people's experiences, and join up those stories as well. So the pressure on the more established journals is not to keep going back to the same people, but to purposely bring in different voices so that we can question the way we've seen the world and start to look at it through a different prism altogether, with the climate crisis pretty much front and center. By climate, again, a broader approach as Rod outlined.
Yeah, I think breaking barriers for interdisciplinary collaboration is really key. So what are key takeaways that individuals not in the field of global security can learn and apply in their own fields?
Whether we can define what national security is, it's nevertheless a crucially important role that governments and intergovernmental institutions play. It is consequential in terms of resources and what a government spends its attention on. And so it is not just an academic discussion between two people guesting on a podcast. Mm-hmm. It is enormously consequential what constitutes national security. And so if we broaden that idea that it's protection from harm, and that there's a component of just looking narrowly at science for a moment, that the biologists have relevance to this discussion, and the physicists and the meteorologists and the veterinary scientists and the disease ecologists. They all have a piece of this national security 3.0, if you want to call it. their work is relevant to some degree because of the highly encompassing nature of climate change and ecological breakdown. And then go beyond those kinds of scientists and sociologists and economists and people who study law and identity. Because of the enormous expanse and the tentacles that the climate change and ecological disruption will affect societies globally, all of us have a piece of that kind of security. And so when I go out and talk to, for example, ag scientists who don't think they have anything to do with national security, I just go through, well, look what you're doing. You're ensuring food security for the nation and other nations. You're protecting the economic security of the nation, right? You're part of this. This is not some externality in some domed building in the Capitol. This is a part of what you do as well.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I would just add a slightly different tact that the pandemic, as I alluded to before, has provided a very useful sort of topographical map that shows us the pockets of real vulnerability and weakness in our modern society. And I'm thinking of the workers in the meatpacking plants who had no choice but to risk their lives. This was pre-vaccine, or their families' health and lives, by continuing to work in unsafe conditions. But also people who are one step away from a health crisis that will bankrupt their families and change their children's educational trajectory, perhaps no longer being able to go to college. So security, as I said before, is a freedom from fear. And if you have fearful people, perhaps it makes disinformation, it's a more fertile ground for disinformation to take hold. So one thing leads to another. So you're not hearing me say the word climate change, but I do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic stems from similar root causes. And so we could use this very real world, unfortunately real experience of the pandemic to show us how to build a stronger, more secure nation and a more secure world. Similarly, and we don't have time for this, but the roots of the Russia-Ukraine crisis are also cause for some reflection about how to make a more secure world. And so we've got it all right in front of us. It's just a question of teasing it out and having people work together to create a new understanding of new security realities in the 21st century.
Great takeaways that really make you think. Last but not least, we would love for you to recommend some resources to our listeners. Anything about global security, knowledge translation, or climate change, something helpful that comes to mind. Possibly your newsletter, Carol?
Well, Rod, why don't you go first, and I'll think about some things as well.
I might want to recommend the work of my my institute that I belong to, the Council on Strategic Risks. Under that is the Center for Climate and Security that think about climate as a national security issue. Another part of this institute is the Ecological Security Program that you mentioned up top that I'm the head of. That is really looking at how ecological change and ecological disruption manifests itself as society and security stresses. I just wrote a report on the societal and security implications of pollinator losses and loss of seed dispersal. I'm proud of this. I think it's the first report of its kind. And then in addition to that, being less selfish, I would also highly recommend reading a book called The Silent Earth, which is a book, I'm going to forget the author, but basically looking at the implications of loss of insects. You wouldn't think of loss of insects in a security context, but I see it all through that book. It's wonderfully written. And it is, I don't remember who it is.
Dave Goulson, is that correct?
Yeah, that's it.
I have a number of things I'd like to recommend that have influenced my thinking. I mentioned Alexander von Humboldt, and I think one very accessible book on him, his life, is called The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, which is W-U-L-F, I think. And then just a different way of thinking about how a broken down healthcare system in the United States makes us insecure. Timothy Snyder, who's actually a professor at Yale and an expert on authoritarianism, wrote an interesting little book called Our Malady. I think it's subtitled Lessons from a Hospital Diary, but it's about his near-death experience in the hospital, which actually was right before the pandemic started. So if you actually read his book in light of what later happened, you can see that we have a lot of holes to fix in healthcare in the United States. And then finally, yes, I am embarked on a new venture with a newsletter on Substack.com called Reimagine, which is working its way towards, reimagining our world in light of these new security realities. And it looks like I might be taking some detours right now through history, looking at the experience with authoritarianism, actually in Portugal, from about 1932 to 1974, to see if that recent memory of autocracy can provide a culture with any immunity against the current rise in authoritarianism. But anyway, it's all part of what we've been talking about today. So I'd love to have more readers.
Perfect. That was a lot more resources than I was expecting. So we'll be sure to include all of the links to the books and resources in the description below. So to summarize, today we covered what security really means, how security has evolved and adapted over time, as well as the concepts of knowledge translation in a security context. And we also learned about the importance of systems thinking, meaningful communication, interdisciplinary collaboration, as well as representation of underrepresented and marginalized voices to encourage a new paradigm to ensure a more equitable and intersectional approach to security, especially when addressing global issues such as climate change. So with that, we'd like to thank our guests again, Rod Schoonover and Carol Dumaine, for this enlightening conversation. And we hope that this conversation continues far beyond just our podcast episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and Isabelle.
That's it for today, right from the heart of Vancouver. Thanks to UBC AMS for supporting this podcast.
Keep in touch in the meanwhile on Twitter at RAINCOAT Podcast. Till next time.
Stay dry and stay safe.